Excellent. Hello, everybody. I'm Pippa Oldfield. I'm the head of programme at Impressions Gallery. Very warm welcome to Impressions and to Bradford on this rainy afternoon. And especially so if you're here as part of the Bradford Literature Festival. It's great to have you here. If it's your first time here, just a few words about Impressions. We are a charity that helps people understand the world through photography. We're supported by Arts Council England and Bradford Council. And we'll be celebrating 10 years in Bradford next year in this fantastic building. But we're actually much older than that. We were set up in 1972. We're one of the oldest specialist photography venues in Europe. We do a whole programme of exhibitions which tour nationally and internationally. We publish on photography. We do a lot of outreach and learning and education work with schools and colleges, with young people, with community groups. And we also do lots of events like this, so talks and workshops. And there are always many opportunities to take part. And we really encourage you to come and enjoy the space. It's very much a social hub for getting inspiration and sharing ideas about photography. So today's event explores the work and legacy of Maud Sulter, an artist, curator and poet of Scottish Ghanaian descent. And Maud worked from the late 1900s onwards and aimed to, as she, in her words, to reinvent the visual imagery of black women. She wanted to uncover hidden histories, real or imagined, that addressed the lack of representation of black women in art, history and culture. And literature was very much part of her work, and as you'll find out, poetry and prose texts were a big part of her artwork. She very sadly died in 2008, aged 47, so her career was cut short. And her work has been a little bit overlooked since then, but this show has been incredibly well received by visitors and critics. It has, as you'll see from the comments book, it's really seems to resonate with our visitors. And it's one of a number of projects, I think Malcolm will go on to talk about this, which is helping to restore Maud's reputation as a significant artist of the late 20th century. The show has come to us from Street Level Photoworks in Glasgow, in partnership with Autograph ABP and Train at the University of the Arts in London. It's co-curated by Deborah Cherry from Train and Malcolm Dickson, who's a director of Street Level Photoworks. And thank you very much, Malcolm, for joining us today. With him is Marlene Smith, who is an artist, curator and co-founder of Black Art Group. She's currently working on the Black Artists and Modernism Research Project, also at University of the Arts in London. Marlene was very much part of the same scene as Maud in the 1980s. They both exhibited at the seminal exhibition The Thin Black Line, and Marlene worked on projects with Maud, and for a time they were neighbours in Islington when artists could afford to live there, he said. So we're delighted to have you here. Thank you very much, Marlene. So Marlene and Malcolm will be chatting for about 40 minutes. Then we're going to have 20 minutes for your questions and discussion. We're going to make an audio recording of the tape, so that will be available on our website afterwards. If you want to ask a question, just wait for one of us to bring you the microphone, then we can record your question. If you're tweeting today, the hashtag is Maud Sulter Passion. Our Twitter address is @ImpGalleryPhoto. And a couple of housekeeping points. There are no fire drills. The fire exit is just outside the glass entrance to the right, and the main entrance where you came in. And the toilets are just outside as well. And I just want to flag up as well, we've got two fantastic publications that coincide with the exhibition. Sorry, Malcolm, can I move your laptop? Thank you. This publication by Autograph, which is the collection of the circus, the amazing photo collages over there, and that's £3. And then there's also an excellent and in-depth introduction to Maud's work, which is available at the special exhibition price of £15. It's usually £25. And it has loads of reproductions, and the poems are reproduced in there as well, so it's well worth buying. I think that's it. I'll hand over to Malcolm.
Thank you, Pippa. It's a wonderful presentation of this exhibition here at Impressions, so I'd like to thank Impression staff for doing that. I've been introduced as a co-curator. I'm a little bit of a gate crasher on the co-curatorial side of this. More about coordinating things rather than curating, because credit has to be given to Deborah Cherry, who's something of a scholar and a real champion of Maud's work, and to Ajamu, who's also London-based. Is this sound okay? Is it booming? Is it okay? Yeah? Yeah. Can you understand what I'm saying? I'm not going to apologise for my accent, but it's quite clear. Okay. So there's a connection that Maud had with Street Level Photoworks, the organisation that I work for, prior to my entry into the organisation. As well as being Glasgow born and raised, Maud had a couple of major exhibitions at street level. The seminal series Zabat in 1989, and that was followed by Hysteria in 1992. There's some of the works from the Hysteria series here, some of the works from Zabat over to my left. A configuration and re-curated version of Hysteria will take place this year in Liverpool, but Marlene will mention something about this a bit later on. But I just wanted to mention some of the other exhibitions that Maud has undertaken, just to give more scope to the geographical reach and the places and the organisations that she worked with. In addition to those two exhibitions at street level, she curated a large exhibition called Photogenetics, reviewing the lens of history. And that was accompanied by a conference which brought to Glasgow about 20 different women artists covering a variety of media. I think Claudette Johnson was on that show as well. Maud was Scottish, she was British, but very much international in her outlook. She lived in Scotland, London, but also in West Yorkshire. She set up, she co-wrote the book Passion, Discourses on Black Women's Creativity, which was published in 1990, which she undertook with Lubena Hamid, who's a very important figure within the Black Arts movement. Urban Fox Press was the publishing company that they set up. Her first photo series was shown at one of the first feminist venues, the Pavilion in Leeds. And she made a joint contribution in 1988 to the exhibition Along the Lines of Resistance at Cooper Art Gallery in Barnsley. That was featured in a special issue of Feminist Arts News. She undertook a residency in Sheffield. She showed a body of work called Plantation at Leeds Gallery. She was commissioned by Paul Wilson of the Mag Collection, along with 8 other women artists, to produce new work on the theme of history and interventions into history. The work that Maud produced for that is called Twa Black Women, and it's over at the back to my left, to your right. That exhibition was also quite significant. It was shown at Ferns Art Gallery in Hull and then toured to various venues, including the Cartwright Hall in Bradford and Fruit Market Gallery in Edinburgh. There's lots of stories about Maud's activities in London itself. We'll hear a bit more about them, I think, from Marlene. So I'll skip that and move on a little bit. This is Maud as a photographer, as a curator, as a writer, but she was lesser known as a poet and a writer of fiction. And she often combined these media within her art practice itself. And one of those works or installations was Alba. And I think since this is the context of Bradford Literature Festival, it would be nice to hear Maud speak herself. And this is a series of very short pieces that she wrote as part of that installation. And it relates directly as well to some of the themes of Twa Black Women, which is about to black women who, based in the court of King James in Scotland in the 15th century. So we'll have a listen to that and then we'll move on.
Auld Lang Syne in the kingdom of Alba lived a wolf sae fierce its howl would chill the marrow in a brave man's heart and still the complacency of a fair woman's soul. Cold though it was in those far times, there were wanton passions in the air, even in those who previously had no care, amidst plots of revolution, tyranny and death. Black people at the Scottish court fired up, hot tempers, wild emotions, and jealous lust. Moon and sun and stars we share, yet in the depth of night I turn, you are not there. I long to touch your gentle cheek, caress your tensile forearm, seduce your ears with gentle curses, and when the deal calls, protect your shadow from the clench of fate. Be still. Let not your pulse ignite a rage at nation-state or family feud, for home resides inside your heart. Where it beats is God to me. The waves never stop, they carry on ceaselessly, sounding against the castle walls as my love for you will never diminish. Standing on the ramparts in the dark, your dogs around us, a soldier at our feet, I close my eyes and pray. Pray that you will not touch me, however accidentally, for I know I would crest like these ceaseless waves and would fall forever through the humid air. My Sunsun betrays me still, my integrity less, knowing my lineage. Royalty, you say. Take me as your second wife, let me have our children, for it is fated, you are my kindred spirit, I am your destiny. Come to me at the end of a long day of government, lay in my arms, fall into the well of my lovingness, climb yourself out by the power of your loins, the courage of your heart. Make me love you with all the spirit of Sekhmet, beloved, bewitch me, fly to me through time and space. Place your arms around me, possess me then with the lightness of gossamer, kiss me once, I too fly. Tales of village, blood, responsibility, chieftaincy. Set me rites of initiation into your inner world, the one you fly from. Suspecting you told me things you had told no one else, now you move 1 extra inch away from me, visibly, I shudder. From fear and longing. You are struggling against your longing. No visible flaws alerted you to danger. I have no arms of war. Later.
Work is also available to listen to here as well, if you'd like to listen to that again. But let's go back to part of one of the beginnings, shall we say, in the 80s. And Marlene, you're part of Team Maud at the moment, I do believe, one of the people who's custodians, if you like, of the legacy, of the formidable legacy of Maud. But tell us about meeting Maud in the context of those times.
Okay. It is a bit of a formidable legacy. And when I first met Maud, I can't remember exactly what year it was, but it would have been about 84 or 85. And actually, I was a student at the time. I had been studying here in Bradford, undergraduate student of art and design. And the 1980s were a time when we didn't have email and we didn't have mobile phones and such. So what would have happened would have been that Maud Sulter would have written to me, and I'd have picked up a letter at my flat in Manningham. We would have corresponded, and I would have made an arrangement with her to have a conversation in Birmingham, which is where I'm from, in my mother's house at a specified date and time. And in the 1980s, I was in my early 20s, and I had kind of come of age and was starting to get sort of politically conscious, and had already kind of started that process before I started to study art. And the context in which Maud had contacted me had been via Eddie Chambers, who was a member of a group of students that I was also a member of, called the Black Art Group. And the Black Art Group was a group of radical students that were thinking about our identities and making art at the time. So Maud had written to me, and what I remember most profoundly about speaking to her was that I'd had this correspondence with Maud, obviously through letters, and I knew she was a black woman like myself. We were of similar age, but I just remember picking up the phone and hearing that voice, that Scottish, Glaswegian voice, which completely, in 1984, completely threw me, because I just hadn't envisaged that black people, I was that ignorant, would be in Scotland. So that was the first thing that I remember about her. That her voice was beautiful, but the image, whatever image I had in my head of who this radical black woman was, and the voice that came across, that kind of threw me. And I don't remember when exactly I first met Maud, but in the early to mid 80s, actually, Malcolm, she was known more within that kind of group of young black practitioners that were working around identity and around politics. She was known as a poet, and her first collection as a black woman, I remember going to readings where that was her primary thing that she was doing at the time. She was writing and performing these poems. But it wasn't until 85, when we were both in an exhibition at the ICA, which was organised by Lubaina Hamid, called The Thin Black Line, that I saw her visual work. And later, I think a year later, I organised an exhibition at the Black Art Gallery in Finsbury Park, which is where I curated a show that she took part in. But the early 80s, the early to mid 80s was a time when, a generation, I would say, of black people who were either born in the UK or schooled here were coming of age. And we look back at that time now from here and think of it and see it and refer to it as the Black Arts Movement, because there was a proliferation of exhibitions, of poetry, of performance that happened over that decade, which really was being driven by that generation.
And these readings that Maud undertook, what kind of places was that done in? Was that in flats and cafes? What kind of venues?
I think my most vivid memory of Maud is that reading at the Battersea Arts Centre in London on Lavender Hill. And Battersea Arts Centre, if you don't know it, it's a kind of late Victorian building that does have a reputation for being sort of starting as a kind of community theatre type of space. So it's on the fringes of the arts sector, and a space that would have theatre and performances and also exhibitions. So a number of exhibitions, both by the Black Art Group and other artists, was organised at Battersea Arts Centre. So some of the exhibitions that Maud took part in, certainly one very important exhibition that was organised by Lubaina Hamid called Black Women. Sorry, Maud organised Black Women Time Now, but Lubaina Hamid also organised quite a large show that happened at Battersea Arts Centre. So this is all happening around from, say, 82 right up until 89. There were just a number of exhibitions, performances, festivals, celebrating Black people's presence, reflecting on a particular generation. But Maud was particularly instrumental in making things happen that focused on the work of women. I mean, she really championed that.
So Thin Black Line is largely held up to be one of the main exhibitions, and I suppose it is main insofar as it was the first exhibition, perhaps, that we could say was held in a mainstream metropolitan arts establishment. Some of the work that Maud had in that exhibition, Poetry in Motion, is in the display case there. And that was also work that was drawn from as a black woman, so she was merging her collage work with her poetry, even way back then, and it's really quite fascinating.
Yeah, I do. My recollection of Thin Black Line, of the Thin Black Line, because there was a kind of reprise of that exhibition at the Tate in 2012. But we'll come on to that. But the Thin Black Line was an exhibition of 11 black women artists that was organised by Lubaina Hamid. And it certainly wasn't the first time that a group of women had put exhibitions together, and it certainly wasn't the first exhibition that Lubaina organised. But because it was at the ICA, it's remembered as exceptionally significant because it was the establishment sitting up and taking notice of us, I guess. So it was a really exciting thing to be involved in at that time, because a lot of the women that were in that show, I myself was in my early 20s, so a lot of the artists taking part in the show were quite young. But I mean, one of the things that I'm doing myself at the moment, I'm working on a project called Black Artists and Modernism, and I'm really interested in the retrospection of looking back at the 1980s and putting it into some kind of perspective. So the Thin Black Line is a very important and significant marker in terms of the relationship between that work and the wider establishment. But I think that each of the exhibitions that Lubaina organised at that time, leading up to Thin Black Line and after, are as important in terms of what they do and say about creative practice, if you like.
So if we could maybe just talk a little bit more about the Black Arts Group. Sure. That includes yourself, Claudette Johnson, Eddie Chambers, Donald Rodney and Keith Piper.
That's right.
And you were based in the Midlands.
Yeah.
I guess, would it be right to say that you were maybe the first generation of black art graduates who were largely born and raised in Britain?
I think we thought we were at the time. Mm-hmm. But what's one of the things that's really interesting to me now that there is more scholarship happening around black people's presence and around black artists in particular, is that we're finding that there have been several generations of artists that have come here from what is now the Commonwealth. So there have been artists from Africa, from the Caribbean, from India, that have graduated in art colleges across the country. So at the moment, for example, University College London is doing a project looking back at their alumni and finding students that graduated as early as the 1930s. So we weren't actually the first generation of black artists to graduate, but I think that we were just in a particular social and political moment where we rather than work as individuals in our individual colleges. And when you speak to artists of my generation that were at art school, often they will tell you that they were the only student in their particular year or on their particular course, or there may have been a little, a couple or three of them at a time. So what visual artists tend to do, Malcolm, is that we kind of work individually, don't we? I mean, that's the practice is about working alone, or has largely been. But in the 1980s, for reasons that we've speculated about, there was an impetus and a push to come together and work together, to often not to make the work together, but to show it together and to discuss it together. And I think that was the big difference. And when we sat down to have our talk before we started the event, we talked a little bit about the Caribbean artist movement, for example. And although that is a movement, so that's a movement of artists that were largely from the Caribbean, that were here in the sort of post-war period. And generally speaking, they were artists that were born in the Caribbean and came here to study and to work. But it was largely a movement that is more related to literature, I think, than to visual arts. There are a few visual artists involved. But again, they were a group of black artists working and creating work in the UK. And there are some synergies between those two groups of people. I think what's interesting, again, looking back, is that we're much more aware of them now than we were then. So when I was in my 20s, I didn't know about the Caribbean artist movement because nobody had written a book about them. Yeah. So when I was a student, I mean, even as young as at the time when I was doing my A-levels in Birmingham, and I say to my art tutors, we had to, as part of our A-level projects, we had to write an essay. I can't remember how many words you had to write as an A-level essay, but it sounded like a lot of words to me at 18. And so when my tutor asked me what subject was what I was going to write about, I said, I want to write about black artists. And he said, oh dear. And he really didn't think there were any. Mm-hmm. So this was 1981. So in 1981, my relatively well-informed, nice liberal art teachers who were very supportive of me thought that I was going to be the first. So that is how, that's just to give you a gauge of how things have moved on now in terms of the knowledge of what's there. It's not that there were no artists before then. It's just that those artists have not necessarily entered into the canon, hadn't necessarily been written about, certainly hadn't been taught within the art school system at the time. So we weren't the first, but it took us a while to find that out.
I mean, you weren't the first, but you were fairly vocal. The Caribbean artist movement, John LaRose, etc., I mean, that was about setting up your own structures for interpretation and dissemination of the work that you do. So, I mean, from that, John set up New Beacon Books, for example, and then Radical Black and Third World Book Fair, which happened several times. And there was 3 happened in Scotland as well. The Scottish Radical Black and Third World.
It happened
Book
here,
fairs
actually, as well, no?
In Bradford.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I remember going to, is it St George's Hall? No.
Yeah.
I don't think it was St George's Hall, though. It was another, anyway, somewhere around here. And seeing Imru Baraka put on one of his seminal works that I can't remember the name of now. But, so yes, John LaRose and those guys were incredibly important for a number of reasons. One of the things that they did was that they embraced an internationalism, a globalism, around, not just around blackness, but around politics, society, change, and scholarship and they, by inventing and organising something like the Radical Black Book Fair, which happened, as you said, in various parts of the country, they brought the most incredible thinkers and writers to the UK, to a student audience. It was primarily, I would say, a student audience. And that's incredibly important in terms of dissemination of ideas and so on. And so for my generation, those events and those bookshops, such as New Beacon, were really important sources of information. And I say this over and over again. This is the pre-internet age. You couldn't Google it. If you wanted to know what people were doing somewhere else in the world, you had to read stuff and you had to meet them and talk to them.
Yeah, different times.
Definitely.
In the Black Arts Group, though, what is interesting about that certainly we noticed in relation to the term cultural worker, is we're visual artists engaged in different type of media, but you were organisers of your own art and the art of other people, and writing about it as well. And that, again, is about taking control of the discourse around it. And that's very important, because I know that when we were in Glasgow, we became aware of the Black Arts Group in the mid-80s. When I was involved in an artist collective there, we were all, white people, largely, but interestingly, largely working class at a time when people who left art school were largely from the same geographical catchment area. That's just a little footnote, but also about how connections are actually made. But another thing that was rallied against was the notion that you couldn't make issue-based art, or collaborative working was frowned upon, and this is something that the Black Arts Group kind of fought against to a certain extent. In particular, Keith Piper has written a bit about that.
I think that depending on what art school you went to, I suppose it did vary, but generally speaking, making work that was overtly political, that had an overtly political content, was, if not frowned upon everywhere, then it certainly was a controversial thing to be doing. Mm-hmm. It certainly wasn't, it might have been supported within the art school environment to a certain extent, but certainly when you started to want to exhibit work, that's where it wasn't generally something that galleries wanted to deal with. And there was then, and there still is a dialogue that happens around what the purpose of art is, and what it's for and what it should do, and that's, I think that's still a conversation that goes on. But in the 1980s, in the context of the 1980s, in the context of being black and growing up in the UK, it was impossible, I think. Well, for me, it was impossible to be making art that didn't address it directly. I remember when I was trying to find black artists in the early 80s, writing to a wonderful artist who is very much, he's an abstract painter, and he actually came so in 1982, in the autumn of 1982, the Black Art Group, which was, as I said, a group of students, organised what we called a national convention, not a conference, but a convention of black art. And we sent out these posters and handbills calling all radical black students to come to this event. And it was amazingly, astoundingly, students came from all over the country. So at that event, Lubaina Himid was there, Jonna Comfra, who was then part of the Black Audio Film Collective, and actually 3 or 4 members of Black Audio Film Collective turned up. Sonia Boyce came. I mean, so it was a kind of hairs on the back of your neck kind of a moment to be sitting there and having all these students arrive. But the artist that I was in conversation with via these letters, one of the artists that I'd written to as an A-level schoolgirl, was Frank Bowling. Now, Frank Bowling, if you don't know him, is a wonderful painter of abstract work. He makes these huge canvases. He is probably now in his early 80s. So he's probably about my age at the time that he came along to our radical forum. But Frank had been in the US in the 1970s, and the US had already had its kind of black arts movement moment. And he had written quite intelligently about the role of art. So he wasn't coming to our conference to say, yes, go for it and do your radical stuff. He was coming to have a conversation about what we as young emerging artists should be doing with our work. So it was contentious then, and it's continued. That conversation has continued.
Mm-hmm. It's quite interesting. Black Audio Film Collective and Jonna Comfra has been, to a certain extent, reappraised now as well. A lot of that work is coming back into contemporary currency, which is really fascinating about a lot of the politically potent work of the 80s, how it's coming back with, shall we say, with the same political prowess, or whether is it historical revisionism? I don't know.
I don't know what this moment means, and because I've been working on a research project that's based at the University of the Arts London, and is also it's a collaboration between 2 universities. In fact, it's between University of the Arts London and Middlesex universities. And that project, the Black Artists and Modernism project, is really looking not just at the 80s, but at black artists' work across the board, and asking questions about its omission from contemporary, from the canon and from art history. And because I've been involved in that project, I am often in dialogue with artists who are finding that their work is being exhibited more than it has been in the kind of 2 decades before. So, in the 1980s, there was this huge outpouring of work, and there was a lot of shows, and that kind of went quiet in the 1990s and early 2000s, and there has been a particular interest, I would say, in the last 3 or 4 years of looking back at the 1980s. Now, I don't think that looking back is purely about looking back at the work of black artists. I think it's a moment where perhaps we are seeing some reoccurrences of certain kind of political and social phenomena in the UK, certainly, that are reminiscent of the 80s. So that's one of the reasons for looking back at what artists and writers and thinkers were saying in the 1980s. But amongst those artists, there is this question where we're saying, well, it's great that there's attention to that work. Not really sure how long the attention is going to last. Not completely sure why it's suddenly so intense. But, we'll, time will tell on that one, I think.
But to go back to the 80s again, in terms of the polemics of the time, there's a very interesting book on the display table over there by Eddie Chambers, who we've mentioned. And in a chapter in that, on the emergence of black women artists, he paraphrases the Combahee River Collective, is that pronounced correctly? And just within the context of what Maud did in terms of the visibility and the voices of black women, it's particularly interesting. So if you allow me just to read a little bit from that. Black women experienced a particular form of oppression because, as black women, they stood in polar opposition to the normative as defined and prescribed by the white masculinist hegemony. You know, you just don't hear of hegemony that much these days. But he then goes on to quote Claudette Johnson. You're a colleague of yours in the Black Art group, and this is just great, you know, just in terms of the articulation of positions. And this is Claudette speaking. Within the term art, the work, experiences, culture and values of the black artist are too often ignored, obscured, devalued, misrepresented and misunderstood. This is perhaps inevitable in a society where the criteria that have defined and controlled the production of Western art are blindly applied to the work of artists whose cultural heritage is Asian, African or Caribbean. The work of the black artist involves expression of her or his life experience. Here in Britain, that experience includes institutional racism and class oppression. Any assessment of black art which fails to fully acknowledge these factors is at best superficial and at worst invalid. But even more poignantly, she says, and it should be you who's reading this, Marlene.
No, go ahead, you're doing a great job.
The white women whose creativity and human potential are forcibly limited, distorted and aborted by male definitions of her sexuality, experiences sexism. The black man who's subtly and brutally degraded by the skein of lies and violence designed to maintain and perpetuate his position of economic vulnerability, where his labour is cheap and abundant, experiences racism. While the black woman experiences oppression on the grounds of her sex, sexuality and race, there is not yet a word that properly describes the specific and deliberate nature of the oppression. She does not experience sexism exactly as the white woman, nor racism exactly as the black man. The quality, nature and forms of her oppression relate to her specifically as a black woman with a history and struggle of her own. This is the present out of which the black woman the black woman artist creates her future. Quite like that.
Yes.
Does that feel, oh, that's the past? Or is there a certain, that's quite poignant to now?
It'd be great to be able to say that that was the past, Malcolm. But I think that the points that are raised in that passage that you read are still as poignant today as they were whenever that was written. But hearing you read those words reminds me of the sense of urgency of that time, the articulation of that time, and there's something about those words that does feel as if it's been written from that time, rather than it doesn't feel like something that's been written today. But I think one of the reasons that there's interest in that work is because some of those issues that are raised are still as potent today as they were then.
Okay. Well, time is moving on a little bit because we want to open it out to questions to Marlene.
Nice try.
I mean, there's lots of exhibitions and events that could be mentioned in all of this, but time doesn't allow. But if you dig a little, you'll find out more in the various publications and books across the way. You're going to be curating an exhibition of the work of Hysteria in Liverpool. What's the venue and tell us a little about that?
So very quickly, Hysteria was actually developed when Maud was a Montmartre resident at Tate Liverpool. And a few months ago, a group of women who run an establishment called Blackburn House, which is really a learning centre learning and enterprise centre for women. And the women that are involved in running that centre remembered seeing Hysteria in its first iteration at Tate Liverpool. And they have this wonderful, I think it's an 18th century building. It is certainly a Grade 2 listed building. And they would like to bring Hysteria, the whole project. And what we see here is an extract from the project to that building. And I think it has a lot of resonances because it's a project that is specifically, the Blackburn House project is specifically about women and women's development. And the Hysteria series is partly inspired by the story of a black woman from America who at a time when black people were still being sold as slaves, actually, was left America to become a sculptor in Rome. And I think Maud's, forgive me if I'm misquoting her, but Maud says of this woman, her name is Edmonia Lewis, she says that Edmonia Lewis went to Rome, was very successful, and then promptly disappeared. And so the whole project, the Hysteria project, partly is recovering that history, although she does so in a fictionalized way, which Maud does constantly with her work. And I think there's a lot of resonances for the Hysteria project with the Blackburn House, and that will be happening, hopefully, in October.
Very good. So that's part of a continuum of reappraisal of Maud's work, and hopefully, as a consequence, many of the other artists who have made particularly important work. The exhibition that was on Autograph in London was an iteration of the Circasse works, which is the whole collection is on the walls at the back there. First time they've been seen all together as a set since 94, 93, 94. The small original collages that Maud produced, she worked from small collages in the pre-digital age and got these blown up. Anyway, that's going to be on at Le Photographe Arles, the big photography festival in the south of France in July. So that's yet another thing to celebrate round about the legacy of Maud. What about your own visual arts practice? Is the research kind of eating that up temporarily at the moment?
I will share this one little anecdote with you. As part of this resurgent interest in the 1980s, currently there's an exhibition that's on at the Van Arber Museum in Eindhoven, which is Holland. And the whole show is looking at the 80s, but there's a chapter, if you like, which is looking at the Black Arts movement in London, in the UK. And as part of I'm taking part in that show, and in the room that my work is being exhibited in is some work of Maud's, amongst others. And in the piece that I made in 1987 there's a reference to Edmonia Lewis. And the image of Edmonia Lewis that I use in the show is actually a postcard, and on the back of that postcard, only I know this obviously, is a message from Maud, where she sent me this postcard in 1980, I would imagine 1985, 86, and it's actually part of the piece of work. So there are all kinds of synergies and resonances of this work that kind of go on giving, if you like. So that's a lovely thing.
I think that exhibition is coming to Nottingham. Is that
That's
correct?
That's right. So in January, a version of the Van Arber exhibition on the work of black British artists of the 1980s specifically is going to be shown at Nottingham Contemporary. So do look out for that.
I think I'd rather go and see it in Eindhoven. It'll be cheaper as well than Nottingham. No disrespect to any people from Nottingham here. Yeah, I forgot about that show actually. Yeah, it looks fantastic. So is there anything else you'd like to add?
God, there's so many things that I'd like to add.
Yeah.
But just to mention the Black Artists and Modernism project again, there's going to be a conference in October. So please do look out for that. That will be happening. It's going to be a 2-venue event over 3 days, taking place at the University of the Arts, London, which in old money is Chelsea School of Arts, and or in this particular instance, it's Chelsea School of Arts, and Tate Britain. So it'll be the 2 venues are next door to each other. So that's something to look out for. Yeah, I think I'll leave it with that.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, John Shepherd. I can quite understand that at the 1980s there was a movement of which you were a part and Maud was a part to put black artists and black women artists in particular back into the books, back into common knowledge. I can quite believe that. I wasn't aware of it at the time, I'm afraid. But obviously it's much the same phenomenon as British history generally having omitted black people who've been here for hundreds of years and you wouldn't know to read about Britain. Does there come a point, although I think from what you've said we've not reached it yet, so perhaps I should say, will there come a point when to have a black artist group could be counterproductive?
I think that some people, both working and writing today and people that were working and writing when the Black Art Group existed, would say that there always is that point. I think there's a conversation to be had about what strategies one employs. So these days I often come across young artists who are making quite political work, but who choose not to frame their work in that way. So they would not necessarily announce their identity within the interpretation of their work. What they would do is make those radical images, but not announce themselves as black. They would not write a book called As a Black Woman. They would not be in a black art group. However, in the content of their work, they're exploring who they are and what they think about today, and that is what comes through in the work. So I think that folk employ different strategies at different times, depending on what they're dealing with. And I do understand that argument that says, I don't want to be... The argument that when an artist says to me, I don't want to be considered as a black artist, I want to be considered as an artist, I absolutely understand that. So I was recently working, and still am working, on a project with an artist called Gavin Yanches. Gavin was born in 1948 in South Africa. He made some really seminal works in the 1970s, at a moment when he was coming out of the South African situation. He left South Africa and came to Hamburg to do his postgraduate studies. And during that time, this is at the height of apartheid, he became interesting to the authorities back home when he was in Hamburg. And to cut a very long story short, he made these seminal work called seminal prints some of which are on show in the Van Arber show that we just talked about. And he made a particular set of works called South African Colouring Book. The South African Colouring Book, if you don't know it, just look it up online. It's a wonderful set of images which critiques apartheid. Rolling back now another 40 years after that, Gavin has had a very distinguished career, and he's worked outside of the UK, but still in Europe. When I contacted him to talk about the Black Artists and Modernism project, one of the things that Gavin said in his email is that I don't want to talk about my work in terms of its blackness. And I think that's a really interesting thing. Now, it's not because Gavin feels that art should not be political, but it's about the way that work can be marginalized and reduced. Now, one of the main purposes, one of the main driving forces behind the Black Artists and Modernism project is that even though certain works have been collected, you can see the work of black artists in Tate Britain right now, for example. When it comes to interpreting that work, what's tended to happen across the board, whether the work is political or not, is that it's spoken about in socio-political terms. So you will know where the artist was born, what their ethnicity is, what the mix is it Afro-Ghanaian, is it, you'll know all of this stuff about them. But what you won't know is what they make. Now, in an art historical context, that is ridiculous. And yet it happens, and it happens consistently and persistently. Racializing the black body, the black person, happens whether you make the political work or not. And I'm not. I don't advocate. Let me say this to you. Race doesn't. I understand that there is one race. I understand that. As a black person who was born in the UK, I also understand that the world doesn't understand that. I understand it, but it's not. That's not the everyday understanding of who we are. And so the work that I made in the 80s is a reflection of that. It speaks to that. However, if you are a curator who is collecting my work and discussing my work, I would like part of the conversation of the work to be about the materials, the formal qualities, the textures of the work. What I find across the board is that conversation is yet to happen. So, we are in a really difficult, embryonic moment in terms of having grown-up, intelligent conversations about race. But I do not advocate the thing where if we don't talk about it, it won't exist. So that's a very long answer to your question, but I hope it does answer it.
That's a very good one.
Thank you.
And it's complicated, but what about the role of larger institutions like or Autograph in this respect? Briefly.
All right, I'm going to try. I heard that, Malcolm. I don't know. I really don't know.
Those contributions and interventions are necessary at the same time.
Yeah, let me qualify. I don't know
everything that you've said there.
So in 1991 to 94, I was director of the Black Art Gallery. The Black Art Gallery was a space that was set up 10 years before that by a group of people and by an artist called Shakadedi. In 2011, when I was talking about the work that we'd done at the Black Art Gallery, somebody provocatively said to me, "So, if you could, would you open the Black Art Gallery today?" And I hesitated because I understand about how institutions can become marginalised before they've even opened their doors. And so what I'm saying to you about Autograph and Innova is that they're operating in a different time now to the time that they were set up. So Innova and Autograph, I think Autograph is slightly older, so that would have been like late 80s. And Autograph was set up as the Association of Black Photography. So they're having to rethink their roles in relation to even bigger institutions. I would say that there definitely is some purpose for them and that they can find and have found and do find purpose. I mean, Autograph did the most fabulous exhibition a couple of years ago, which is now one, I think, at the V&A, for example, which I don't know that any other institution would have done. Black Chronicles, I'm talking about. But I think those institutions have to find purpose, and for me, that means doing the thing that nobody else. But I think all institutions should be doing that too. Yeah. That was nearly brief.
It was. Any other questions or remarks?
I was wondering what Maud would make of all of this. If she were in this survey of her work, what she would make of it.
This is a difficult one. I would like to think, Malcolm mentioned Team Maud, and I was involved in the show that I think started this whole focus on Maud's work off, which was held at Malcolm's institution in Glasgow. I'd like to think that she'd be really pleased, that she'd look at the Passion book, the content of it, the show at street level, the shows that have happened since, and she'd be very pleased and she'd be complimentary about what we've done. Look at Malcolm's face. However, I think Maud was prolific. Maud was always looking forward. Maud was always researching. Maud was always ambitious. So she would have already moved on. And I haven't got a clue where she would have moved on to. Is my answer.
Yeah, I mean, if Maud was around, she wouldn't need 10 other people doing it all for her, because she'd be doing it herself. And you're right. I mean, you had a very close association with Maud, unlike myself. I met her a couple of times, but I think she understood the need to intervene at higher levels always, and it's very intriguing to think, where she would be artistically, but also within the institutions. The mind boggles, as they say.
Yeah, but it would be really impressive, whatever she was doing.
Yeah.
Anybody else? Any more questions? Maybe we should draw that to a close, I think, unless there's anything either of you want to add. Thank you so much. It was absolutely fascinating. That just flew by, and it was a really interesting insight. Really appreciate that. So thank you very much. If you join me in thanking our speakers.